Now in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to actually deploy a server into AWS. So we're going to deploy an EC2 instance. Now, just before we do that, what I've noticed is that we've made a mistake with the require here. So it should actually be required with a D. So in the last lesson, we didn't include the D after require. So please make sure you've got the D as required underscore providers. So that's just something from the last lesson. Now, as I said, we're going to now deploy a server into AWS. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to configure a provider. And provider is slightly different to the Terraform settings that we've just created, in that it tells Terraform which provider or which cloud provider we're going to be using for this configuration. So for this, I'm going to use the provider keyword, and then I'm going to specify AWS as my provider. If you're using Google Cloud or if you're using Azure, this would be Azure or Google Cloud, depending on the provider that you want to launch into. So in our case here, we're going to deploy into AWS. So our provider is going to be AWS. And then we're going to open the block using the curly braces. And then what we need to do is we need to specify a region. So we're going to add region. Now, if you're not familiar with AWS, it has different regions that you can use to deploy your infrastructure into. These regions are physical locations throughout the world, such as North America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Asia. Now, for our purposes, we're going to use the North America region, in particular Ohio, which is referred to as US East 2. Now, you can change the region to any of the available regions that you want. Now, if I go to the browser here, I have the regions that are available in AWS open. So the regions that are available are on the AWS website here. And as you can see, this table lists all of the regions that you can launch resources or you can launch infrastructure into using Terraform. Now we're using the US East 2 region, but it's usually best practice to use the region that's closest to your users. So now if we go back to our Terraform code, now that we've got the provider configuration set up, we can now start writing the code to deploy a single server to AWS. Now, each type of provider, be it AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, has many different kinds of infrastructure that you can deploy, such as servers, databases, load balancers, and so on. In Terraform, these infrastructure are referred to as resources. And when you're creating these resources, you have to follow a general syntax that Terraform defines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in the syntax. So this is not the actual Terraform code that we're going to be deploying, but just to show you the syntax that's used in Terraform. Now, for any type of infrastructure that you wish to deploy with Terraform, you need to use the resource keyword followed by the provider name and then an underscore, then followed by the type of resource that you want to create, such as a server or a database. Now, different providers will have different names for resources. And after the resource type, you specify a name. So this is this bit here. And the name for this resource you can use to refer to inside your Terraform code. So when you specify the name, later on, you can then use this name to use an attribute. And we're going to discuss what attributes are in detail later on. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually create a resource with actual Terraform code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this syntax here. And for any resource, as you mentioned, we need to use the resource keyword. So we're going to say resource. And then obviously the resource that we want to deploy is the AWS instance. So that's what I'm going to use here. So AWS underscore instance. So this is the EC2 instance that's available in AWS. And I'm going to name my instance so that I can reuse it somewhere in my code. So I'm going to call it my server. And then we open our block here. I'm going to add a couple of arguments as it's known in Terraform, and then we're going to explain exactly what these are. In this configuration, we're setting up an EC2 instance. We start with the resource keyword to indicate that we want to create an infrastructure. Then we specify the provider, which is AWS, followed by an underscore and the resource to create, which is an instance here. So the provider is AWS and the instance that we want, or the resource rather, that we want to use is instance. As for the name of this resource, we're calling it my server. You can call this whatever you like. Usually it's something that describes the resource that's being created by Terraform. As we'll see later on, you can then use this name to get the output attributes when the resource is created by Terraform. We'll discuss what attributes are in just a moment. Now, inside the block, we also specify what are called arguments here. So at this moment in time, we've got two arguments. Here we're setting the AMI and the instance type. The AMI is the Amazon Machine Image. This is a virtual image snapshot that you can use to launch a virtual machine. Essentially, this is a snapshot image of the Linux operating system that will be used to boot up the virtual machine that AWS creates for you. This image includes things like the permissions and the software that's needed to launch the virtual machine. Now, as a value for the AMI, we've specified a string identifier. Now, this will be used by Terraform to look up this AMI image, pull it down, and then use that image to launch our EC2 instance. Then we have the instance type. In AWS, you can specify the type of virtual machine that you want to launch. You can choose from different virtual machine configurations, and the T2 micro is the smallest in terms of memory, storage, CPU, and velocity. Now, there's a very wide range of options available depending on the type of need that you have. You could go up to, say, 64 vCPUs, 256 gigabytes memory, and plenty of SSD storage. Now, this will obviously cost an enormous amount and is definitely not included in the AWS free tier. However, the T2 micro is more than enough for our needs as you proceed, and it's also inside the AWS free tier. Now, you can look up the different instances that are available on the AWS website. So I have here open the instances page, and it shows you a breakdown of all the different instances that you can launch and what the different capacity is. So how many vCPUs, how much memory, how much SSD, and so on. So if you go back to our Terraform code, I mentioned earlier on that inside of the curly braces block, we have arguments. But what exactly is meant by this? Most of a Terraform configuration consists of what's called arguments to configure the Terraform resource. Now, arguments have the form of the identifier and the expression. So the identifier in our case here is the AMI, and then you have the expression, and we've got another argument, and the identifier here is the instance type, and then we have the expression, which is T2 micro. Each resource type defines the arguments its resources can use. Now, for example, we're now using the AWS instance. Now, the Terraform documentation for this provider gives us all of the arguments that we can supply. So if you go back to the browser here, and I already have the AWS instance documentation page open. Now, if I click on the arguments reference here, it gives us all of the different arguments that we can supply to the AWS instance resource. Now, some of these arguments are required and some are optional, but the documentation for each resource will clearly label which one is required and which one is optional. Now, as we've mentioned more than once, Terraform supports dozens of providers, and each of which supports dozens of resources, and each resource has dozens of arguments. Now, it's impossible to remember all of them, and as a best practice, when you're writing Terraform code and creating infrastructure, you should have the docs page for the provider that you're using open, and the docs for the particular resource that you wish to deploy. Now, you can view all of the providers and all of the documentation on the Terraform website.